So we'll kick off. Mit and Da, good morning. Dinar Chwiol. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us on what is, at least here in St Eville, a slightly overcast morning for what I think is the third and slightly later than usual online Cornish music symposium from Ilow. So we're a little later than the festival normally runs, but that's given us slightly more time to reflect on the course of the year. And thinking back to the start of 2022, we had some sort of lingering COVID restrictions, but over the course of the spring and summer, life has seen a broad and enthusiastic return to in-person events as we all started to get back together and enjoy making and sharing music in Cornwall. And at the Cornish National Music Archive, we had the Music from the Clay Country project, which focused on brass, choir and traditional music from the Clay district in sort of mid-Cornwall and the sort of St Austell, Bugle, Foy, Parr area, which was an interesting line to draw. Working with performers and community groups, bringing information together on the website and going out and doing kind of workshops and projects, and it was great fun and culminated in an event in July last year, which was the first in-person event for the CNMA, given that this project that started in COVID really and hasn't had its own in person. And then of course Ilow itself moved to Redruth from Newquay, which was quite a leap. And Merv, I don't know if you might want to say a few words about that.
Yes, it was a fairly magical moment, really, because we moved to Redruth, taking a slightly different model for the festival, a kind of town takeover. We had a lot more events around the town rather than hiding away, as it were, in a hotel, and it was an unqualified success, really. Ilow has actually moved on, evolved since October. We've now become Lowender. As a community, a charity incorporated organisation. This means that we can, we're embracing a new group of trustees. Some of us have been around for 40 odd years and are about to say, hang on, it's time to pass it on. So we've got a new board of trustees and a new management committee. So we're moving forward quite emphatically in this coming year. Mind you, we've been called Lowender for some time. There's only people like me that insist upon Lowender. Lowender has been a nickname, so there's not that much change in a sense.
That's fantastic. I'm just sending out a link because we've got somebody that's struggling to get in, so hopefully they will get to us in just a second. 1 minute. Right, so we decided to keep the symposium this year as an online event because they're still a really important part of engaging with Cornish music and everybody who wants to be involved in it. If you don't want to, or if you wouldn't be able to attend in-person events, say if you're a long way away or you can't come for another reason. So this morning we're really pleased to have 3 interviews with 3 people who have been working in or on or around Cornish music. And first, really pleased to have had the opportunity to speak to Gwenno, who I'm sure doesn't need much, if any, introduction here, but just in case, she's a Cornish and Welsh language singer-songwriter, and her most recent album, Trevena, was nominated for a Mercury. And one thing to note is that this interview we did was actually before Ennis Main came out, which is the Mark Jenkins film, which she also contributed to. So we didn't actually get around to discussing her music in that, but there's plenty in the interview anyway. Next up, we've got Merv Davey speaking to Seamas Carey, singer, performer, composer and actor. This time last year, Seamas was just beginning the first tour of Help, I Think I'm a Nationalist. And this year is gearing up to begin another tour and out of Cornwall, bringing that show to new audiences. So we're sorry he can't be with us. But he did actually get in touch with us some time ago when he wrote to ask about his thoughts on Aphex Twin, which is makes up the bulk of what Merv's conversation with him is about. So that's also, he wrote us an article about that, so that's available to read on our website as well. And thirdly and finally, we have a recording of a chat between myself and Chris Trevena, which, as you'll be able to tell from the lighting, was conducted over Zoom on a dark winter evening before Christmas. Chris has embarked on an ambitious project to collect and capture recordings of Cornish music and events over the past couple of years, which has emerged into his Sounds Like Cornwall project. So he's been a huge help and support to the CNMA and for this event as well, and it's very lovely to have him with us today to continue the discussion. So unfortunately, we don't have Gwenno or Seamas with us this morning, so we can't ask them questions directly, but we can definitely pause for a moment after each session for comments or discussion, as I'm sure there'll be points that we want to jump in on or discuss. But also feel free to leave your questions to the end as well, where we'll have the opportunity for a broader chat with Chris. So just housekeeping. We are recording this session, so it'll go up either in full or in part on the CNMA website and Lowenda's website as soon as we can after the event, but we won't record the discussion afterwards. I think you're all pretty Zoom savvy by now, but if you keep yourself on mute, I think that will help everyone hear what's being said on the recordings. If you're having any difficulty with the sound or audio, please let me know in a message and I'll do my best to sort it out. You can type your question as a message using the chat function. So depending on your device, that'll be at the bottom of your screen somewhere. Send me a message or send a message to the group as a whole, and I'll keep an eye on that. Oh, more people coming in, hello. And in all, I think we'll run to a couple of hours or so. So if the discussion's flowing, we can keep going. Please feel free to stay on, but if you need to leave at any point, then thanks for joining us, and you can listen to the rest if you want when the video is uploaded. So if you just give me a sec, I will share my recording, my screen and my recording of the interview with Gwenno. Right, hold on. Can anybody shout if you can't see Gwenno? Press play and let me know of any problems in the messages. So, Dithda, Dinach Probonan, welcome to this session of this year's Cornish Music Symposium. We're delighted to have Cornish and Welsh language musician and songwriter Gwenno with us today to talk about her music and her musical adventures with this year's Mercury Prize nomination for her most recent. Thanks so much for being here. And I wanted to start off by recognising that you've had a considerable musical and artistic journey growing up in a Cornish and Welsh language speaking household, and as a teenager dancing as a cast member in Michael Flatley's Lord of the Dance and Feet of Flames, and then before singing with girl group the Pipettes. And since 14, then writing and performing full-length albums in Welsh and Cornish, which have seen growing popular and critical success. And Tresor's Mercury nomination this year is a hugely significant moment of wide recognition for the Cornish language. And even prior to that, Lake Hof's release in 2018 has been linked with an increase in the number of people speaking and learning and taking exams in Cornish, which is a huge accolade. I wondered if you could just start off by telling us a bit about your experience with the Mercuries, a bit about the reception to Tresor and the Cornish language. You must have had some amazing conversations with the other nominees and the team there.
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience, and we're just hoping, because Mercury Prize has been going for 30 years now. This is the 31st year, and it was actually the first record that was full-length, non-English, which obviously we're really chuffed to be the first, but really hoping that we won't be the last either, because obviously there's a huge linguistic diversity across Britain and Ireland that should be reflected culturally in sort of moments like that, which, I mean, I wouldn't even call it a competition really. I see it more as a platform of saying, here's a taster of what's going on. So it was a fantastic experience. And I mean, yeah, beyond, as magical as you can imagine, because the Mercury Prize is something that's sort of quite an important part of the calendar, as it were, within music and popular culture. So to be a part of that, just, it was wonderful.
Oh, marvellous. And were many other nominees or people that you met or spoke to there at all aware of the Cornish language prior to your Trezor, the entry?
I don't know. I don't think they were, but I think what was quite interesting with the Mercury Prize as well is that, you know, it's quite a whirlwind of a scenario in terms of, like, there's not a huge amount of time. You know, obviously we got to know some people that we didn't know before. There were people there that we knew from before that we caught up with. But yeah, I mean, you know, probably in a way, the fact that we were completely accepted as being part of the furniture is a positive thing. I didn't have, I think with language, it's, I think particularly because we live in we're in a monolingual state. People aren't aware of conversations around language and what that means, beyond everyone needing to speak English because English is the main language. So, but what's been encouraging for me generally, when I've done interviews or anything like that, is that I'm having conversations around what language means. I'm not a linguist at all, but I am interested in the power of language and the power struggles of languages against each other and how that influences the way that communities form and view themselves as well. So yeah, and that's my conversation, which is a less familiar one perhaps.
Given your such an incredible background and a really strongly sort of Celtic one, I wondered what initially sort of spurred you to write and sing in Cornish.
Well, when I was my first job was as an Irish dancer, because you know, it was a huge amount of luck, and in terms of I'd always been Irish dancing classes, and then ended up you could do it as a job, which was not the case until Riverdance happened.
Yeah.
And then I was living in America, in North America, in Las Vegas, because I'd been shipped over there about 17 to do the show there on the Strip, and missing home a lot, and considering my identity within a wider Celtic one because of the success of Irish culture and, you know, particularly Irish dance, that was something that, you know, we all did as teenagers, nationally, you know, within Wales and across the UK. And, you know, that, you know, I was traveling a lot internationally before that for competitions. I'd go to North America, I'd go to Ireland. Yeah. And then thinking about, yeah, my own culture within that context, and then Welsh bands becoming very popular and part of popular culture post Britpop, really, the tail end of that, bands like Super Furry Animals, Catatonia, Manic Street Preachers, and that coinciding with us getting a Welsh Assembly, which just created this new energy, I think, in Wales. And I was stuck in North America, and I was like, oh my God, this is really exciting. It's all happening at home.
Yeah.
Wales is finally part of the world culturally in the way that I had been part of, you know, Ireland's being part of the world culturally within popular culture, and having such a keen interest in music anyway. And so, yeah, I went home and then was just blindly pursuing music and trying to work out what it was and how to make it. And then just put a couple of EPs out in Wales, in Welsh and Cornish.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about those because I read about them when I was sort of looking up your output in preparation for this, and I'm worried I'm going to mispronounce these, but Bodja and Morhood.
Yeah.
Great. Were they your earliest sort of musical adventures in Cornish and Welsh?
Yeah, they were, and it was, you know, I'd come out of a show that was massive and very glitzy, and I was sort of trying to translate that experience to like a very, very DIY culture, which is like Welsh language pop culture, you know, popular music culture. on no budget.
Yeah.
So it was quite an eccentric output, but I kind of feel like it's always been what I've been interested in, and it's been about a sort of a journey of learning how to create it in a way. And I mean, I came down to Cornwall. I did a short tour around some pubs.
Really?
Yeah.
Like around that time in the early
Yeah,
2000s.
so it's like when I was like 18, 19.
I wasn't aware that you kind of had grown up quite separated from a broader sort of Anglo-American sort of cultural exposure. And one of my questions I was going to ask was, being raised in a Cornish and Welsh-speaking household, did you also grow up and listening to or making Welsh and Cornish music?
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing, was that because, you know, I never, because of not having like English pop stars in the house, I never aspired to that because it wasn't part of what my culture was. So that's why it was such a massive moment when those Welsh bands came through in the late 90s, because all of a sudden it was people like me that I saw, rather than, you know, I wouldn't, you know, I couldn't relate to sort of American culture really, even though I think it has had an influence on me now because I've lived there, you know, for like 2 years. So but yeah, no, it is interesting. It was just a lot of playing catch up, I think, in my 20s. But that's fed into what I do now, because I think having that experience of, you know, Celtic culture being so prominent and it being the centre of the world, and the English language really being on the periphery of your life and not that important or relevant, definitely has given me a huge confidence in that as well. So I you know, I have this almost skewed view of what my culture is in a wider, you know, sort of on a wider scale as well, because I do see it as the centre of my world, and then other things are on the periphery of that. And I think it's helped because I've had a look at the periphery and it's interesting and there's lots of stuff going on, but you feel quite grounded in your position as well, and that being equally as valid in the world and the variety of it as well.
I was going to ask, how do you find using the Cornish language as a medium? Like, what does it let you do or express that isn't available to you in Welsh or English, perhaps?
Yeah, it's been huge, you know, because when we did a Dydd Olaf, there's a Cornish song at the end of that, which is one of my dad's poems, Amser. And a Dydd Olaf, like, because Rhys and I make these albums together. He's my husband, he's a producer as well, Rhys Edwards. And we made a pact about a decade ago. We were like, right, we love, you know, records in Welsh and in Cornish. These are our languages. There's loads of stuff going on. There's no reason at all why we can't use these languages and get beyond perhaps just being, you know, singing within those country, which is a really amazing thing to do. But there's no, you know, we're internationalists, we like to travel. So we did a Dydd Olaf, and then I had a record deal, a very, very tiny one, but I had a record deal with a network that would be willing to promote the album. And so making a Cornish album was always something I wanted to do as a concept, just like a very broad concept of I would like to make a Cornish language album. And then I with that I thought, well, this is the opportunity to do it, in terms of just seeing what happens, because I think so much to do with art is about not knowing what the outcomes are going to be, and also trying to challenge yourself and not do the same thing as you've already done. So that was interesting, because then I was like, oh, I've made a Cornish album now, fantastic, that's done now, I can move on. But what happened was that when I made Lecov, was that without understanding what was motivating me, I can get to the Awen in a really amazing way that I perhaps can't get to in the other languages that I have. And it's a kind of again, it's a very conflicting thing for me, because I use Welsh every day, but it's almost like it's everywhere and it's too familiar to me, whereas the Cornish language is, for me, is a place that I can go and express, you know, I can find a corner and express myself very, very intimately and like get to those quite subconscious level, you know, feelings and emotions, and not feel self-conscious at all. And I don't know why. And it's, I mean, I'm sure it's geographical or whatever, and I'm sure it's to do with the language as well. But it does give me something that I hadn't even, I never thought it would. You know, I never predicted that it would, and it has.
There's something I was going to go on to ask, and you've talked about it now. As I understand it, you didn't grow up in Cornwall and you haven't lived in Cornwall for an extended period of time, but you've obviously got this deep connection. And I was going to ask, like, do you see Cornwall as something of a musical home, and ask how the language helps sort of deepen that connection or express that connection that you obviously feel?
It does, and I think the thing about it as well is that I'm conscious of my interests in the arts are to do with absolute beauty within, you know, whether it's music, film, you know, it's like an elevation of the everyday. But I am also really, really interested in the lives of people every day as well. And people's lives inspire me. But I'm conscious that when I sing in Cornish, I'm not necessarily reflecting the lives of people in Cornwall because of that experience that is so unique to the place. And it's hard because I can't help, because I can only make what I'm making, and it is a contradiction.
Just going back to the experience of the language itself in the music, you've talked about music as a universal language that kind of cuts across these boundaries, and the Cornish language in particular as a space to express yourself very freely. But I also read that you mostly spoke in Cornish only to your father, writer and poet Tim Saunders. So I wondered what it's like to be singing to your ever-growing audience in what perhaps when you were younger felt more like a private language.
Yeah, definitely. And so much emotionally and psychologically, so much of me making this record is about growing out of that as well, because I didn't want the Cornish language to be something that was just the language I spoke to my dad in, because the grounding of the language for me in that relationship is really deep and very nourishing, because it's full of love and encouragement. But I think so much to do with me making these records, it's about growing up. So it's about saying, you know, I don't want it just to be a language that I kind of express one relationship in, because, and especially having met so many people who are Cornish speakers in my adult life, realizing there's a whole community of people using the language in different ways, and the sort of wider use of the language, and the sort of the diversity of what that language can express, and that's kind of a driving factor for me.
Yeah,
well.
have you you know, in coming into contact with that community and other sort of Cornish language singers, songwriters, performers, like, have you had like a musical dialogue at all with those people here in Cornwall?
Yeah, I suppose I haven't necessarily done any specific musical projects, but obviously I've got to know people working in film, so that's been great, you know, people like Mark, and that's been really nice to collaborate. I am interested in music, sort of crossing boundaries really in terms of its uses. It's not necessarily always been about just making records. So yeah, to have my music in other people's films. So I think that those collaborations have been really exciting, and again have solidified my relationship with the culture and the people, and helped me understand it better as well.
It sounds to me like you're talking about kind of trying to experience that process of becoming, like, as you experience it and express it. Are there kind of like historical aspects of Cornish language or Cornish music, or even any of the sort of community traditions and events in Cornwall that are sort of shot through with music, like Flora Day or May Day? Does any of that sort of historical aspect play into your work?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, it does in terms of, you know, probably, I mean, I grew up on Brenda Button and Booker as well. So everything that's come out of, and Richard Gendel, and, you know, everything that's come out of the influences that they've had on everything else has been a massive influence, and definitely that's the grounding really in where I'm coming from when I'm making Cornish language music, is those artists, and everything that's come after. You know, it was exciting. Like, we were down in Falmouth at the Cornish Bank, and they've brought back Nos Lowen, and I mean, that's just all really, really exciting. I really want to come down and be able to experience that, because there's a lot of, you know, all that work that Hilary Coleman's been doing in, you know, documenting all of the music that's, you know, sung in communities. So it all feeds into it, and it's a kind of, and again, it all adds to why I get inspired by it, because it's
yeah, that community aspect, I think, as someone who sort of studied community music in an academic sense, those questions that you were just saying, like, who's made this, why have they made it, who's it for, where's it going to be sung, what does it mean to that person, that community, those are all things that I find fascinating too. And, you know, music and identity having this double aspect, where in one sense it's deeply personal and unique to ourselves, however we kind of think of ourselves, but then another aspect is how we connect and find commonalities and become part of communities and engage with something larger than ourselves, whatever sort of form that takes. And music's a wonderful vehicle for that, I think.
And a reflection as well, you know, and I think that's what's fascinating with Cornwall being, you know, a relatively small country, and then you've got Aphex Twin and Luke Vibert, and it's like, I mean, that, you know, Reflex Records and all of that is just, again, it's like, you know, Aphex Twins records are as reflective of the landscape and people and community to me as, you know, a Booker album or a Brenda Wootton album. I just see them all part of the same tapestry, and it's really exciting because it's so diverse then, because it's all just very alive and very, I think, I also, and I try not to over romanticize this element, but I think that there is a, for me, the element that has run throughout Cornish music and culture really is there's a very clear linear boldness to the expression, and I find that with the language as well in terms of the sound, and I'm really attracted to that because I like directness, and I think there's a real directness within Cornish culture. You know, when you catch someone at 3 years old and they learn the language, they've got it for life then, and there's a lot of very deep emotions attached to that period in time, if you've been, you know, if you've had a lucky time of it, and there's a warmth and love tied to that relationship. So yeah, I mean, that's where it needs to happen really. And yeah, and
it seems like there's more and more of that in Cornwall, as you say. Do you feel like, well, I feel like that Lekov and Trezor are incredible legacies. Do you feel that through making music in Cornish, we're kind of helping build a kind of cultural landscape which can be further explored by these new people who will come along and learn?
Yeah, I do. I definitely do. And film, you know, it's like Ed Rowe's new film Mab Hidel is amazing. I watched that recently. And oh God, there's Mawes. There's loads of Cornish language films happening. They're really good. You know, they're like stories about people. And More was the other one as well, which was fantastic. Yeah. So I do think all of this contributes, and I think it's fantastic that there's music and arts and films. But I definitely think it's early as education and music and things that happen within that are like absolute priority in my mind. You know, and I always mention this, but it was it's the record Brenda Wootton and Richard Gendel did, children singing, all those kids singing. And like, for me as a kid in Cardiff, I was so happy. I thought, oh my God, there's loads of kids that speak Cornish in Cornwall, and they're all singing these amazing songs. and obviously was a bit not quite the whole picture because they'd learnt the songs, but again, it's like that's again one of my favorite records, and it's the thing that grounds me in the language as well, is that memory of childhood and feeling like, oh, there's loads of people like me. And I think that's why, you know, these apps and things like this that have kids singing on and, you know, suggesting that there are a lot of children doing this, you know, they're the absolute key, I think.
Yeah, that's marvelous. What a wonderful sort of moment of connection, like regardless of like how true to life your imagination of it was, like that must have been a wonderful feeling.
Yeah, it was amazing. I was just, and I mean, it's such a good album. Like those songs are brilliant, you know, it's like histories, like Humphrey Davey, and, you know, it was just all Trevena, and so it's like, it's such an all-encompassing, it's like a history class. Yeah.
I've got one more question, which is kind of a left field one, and I threw in at the end, only because it's something that fascinates me, and I wonder if you've got a perspective on it. You mentioned in other interviews that you grew up in an intensely sort of political household and have spoken about capitalism and the monetary value of art, and, you know, just thinking about how we've been talking about sort of emotional and cultural value of art and music. And one of the reasons I often heard growing up or thinking about learning Cornish was given against learning or supporting the language was the perspective that it would never bring you any opportunities, sort of financial or otherwise, which I always thought was possibly had an element of truth, but was also quite reductive in a way of looking at the world and experiencing and expressing and understanding. So I'm glad that I've kind of come around myself and started my own Cornish language journey. But there is a trend that some people, I'm sure, would call something like brand Kernewek, which is that kind of commodification of difference and the lifestyle that for some people that live here are lucky to have comes with being in Cornwall. Like, what's your perspective on that? And do you think that music and language or your work plays into it in any way?
Yeah, I think that there's I think branding, because it happens in Wales a lot as well, you know, it's like branding happens and there's a sort of very surface level way of engaging with it, with culture as just as a commodity, and it's very difficult to escape it. I think it's really, really, really hard, because you think like whatever like brand Kernewek is now, that is literally happening because of all the people that have made culture and arts over the past 100 years or more. You know, that's what's, you know, people are taking advantage of, really, the sense of identity and a place and an understanding of the landscape and all of that stuff. And then who does it benefit? Because it very rarely benefits people that it should benefit. I think you always have to look at class when it comes to any sort of cultural expression, and be really conscious of the class element, which I think, you know, is an issue with the branding of Cornwall and the branding of Wales, because it's about escapism, and it's not necessarily, it doesn't benefit working class people that live in either of those countries. And it's really difficult because we live in a Western neoliberalist, capitalist society, that turns everything into a commodity. But I think that music and the arts has a greater value and can overcome those things, because I think it's a more powerful human expression than capitalism is. You know, I think it expresses life better than those systems do.
In last one, I promise.
Yeah,
but,
go.
Only in the sense that it would, when we cut this into bits or condense it down, it would be lovely if we could play a song from the album, and wondered if you would, do you have a favourite song or a song that you feel is kind of like particularly reflective of your relationship with Cornwall, and could you sort of go through that for us?
Yeah, well, I think the song that we really loved playing on our Easter tour was Ardam. And with that song, what I'm conscious of as a Cornish speaker is the limited amount of people that I'm realistically talking to when I'm doing what I'm doing. And I'm also conscious as a Cornish speaker, not living in Cornwall, that I am missing talking to like a vast majority of people that I would love to have a conversation with. And also my feelings and my sort of outlook on the language is that the Cornish language is a community language that is the people's language, and I feel really strongly that that should be the case again.
Pes gorgeous, pes bleddyn, a fydd cans fledden, aral, per vinta jos, per vinta o Lewis, pes death, pes vinta o Hombedes, blema the famieth, blema the famieth, blema the famieth, blema the famieth, the yes G, tia bewema, tia que fide midja, hati, oma vore norbis, a is misfiken. Otani o Kels o Berry, a cara a Neil I Gela, o Karma o Tonsia, a Gola, a Karma a Tonsia, a Gola, a Karma a Bewa, a Lema Queer, Miss a Lema Queer, Malses Po, Onen o Koska, Marnagis, no Bonen o Mar, a Lema Queer, Pes vinta gorgeous, Pes blidden, a fydd cans fledden, aral, per vinta dos, blema the famieth, blema the famieth, blema the
Oh, thanks everyone. That was my conversation with Gwenno. A huge thanks to Merv Davey for bringing that interview down to a helpful half an hour, because we did wander around quite a bit, and it was a really fascinating conversation. And she's by no means the first sort of singer-songwriter to write in Cornish, but she is the first to kind of gain that recognition that comes with the Mercury nomination. And while she didn't win it this time, it's a huge moment for Cornish language and music and culture, and in the sense that, you know, representation does matter, and the kind of saying that if you can't see it, then you can't be it. It was interesting to speak to her and talk about whether, you know, this kind of moment in a really big spotlight will give more people the confidence to start exploring writing and performing music in the Cornish language. And that discussion about Brand Kerno, my left field question that I put at her at the end. Judith, you've mentioned down there, Brand Kerno is an entity being very limiting from the aspirations. You have Welsh relatives and all the children just grew up bilingual, speaking and writing in Welsh at school. Possibly that will occur in Cornwall one day. I feel like we're probably closer to that now than we have been in quite some time. I don't know if anybody wants to kind of jump in and pick up on that, or anything else that came out or stood out of the interview for you. Or even if you have any kind of like reflections on the album, like, have you listened to it? Like, what do you think of it? It's an unusual sound. and one that's would have been quite different to a lot of other things going up for the Mercury at that time. But Merv, have you got any thoughts? You're on mute, but if you unmute, we'll hear what you have to say.
There we go. Yeah. Yes, I mean, I have to say that my two grandchildren absolutely love this album, and it's on in the car all the time when we drive around. It is interesting. I'm fascinated by her reference to Bran Kerner, because she's not flagging up as necessarily a positive thing, and flags it up as a kind of, I suppose, in a sense, it's what sells Cornwall to second homers, which is not what we're after. But also, you know, if you drive around Cornwall, the number of small businesses using Cornish as part of their brand is wonderful. It's Gwynsec for a roofing company, Da Barra, which should be Barra Da, but who cares, for good bread. And, you know, that's a quite different use of Bran Kerner. Well, is it indeed Bran Kerner, or is it just saying, I'm Cornish? But it is fascinating.
Yeah, I find it really intriguing whether people use, you know, seeing, yeah, like I said, she's by no means the first to use Cornish in music at all, but maybe the first to have that spotlight. But in terms of like how you use the language, like, is it a kind of like a gloss that you put on something to give it a kind of air of slight exoticism and ooh, it's different, versus something that's obviously, as she put across in her interview, really heartfelt and comes from like a deep place of creativity and expression that has a lot more to say than this is slightly cooler than saying roofing.
She puts it across very much as an artistic tool, which is quite a revelation actually for me in terms of how Cornish is used. You know, she says she can express things in a way that she might not otherwise do. And she likes the flow of Cornish, which is certainly makes me listen more carefully to lyrics.
I don't know if anyone in the audience has been able to go and see Gwenno perform, but if you haven't, then I would highly recommend it, because depending on, like, one of the nice things, I think I've been lucky enough to see her 3 times now, each with a different kind of type of band. So one was just a duo, I think. One was her on her own at Crescent Kerno, just with her synthesizer and all her electronic kit. And then the last time was at the Cornish Bank sometime last year with the full band. And they were all very different musical experiences, just in terms of how the music was put across. But there was a lot in the, you know, in the room and in the discussion that around, you know, all of her kind of chat with the audience that about Cornwall and language, and it was a really lovely experience to be able to talk to her about that. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? If not, then we can move on and listen to Merv's interview with Seamas. Daniel Woodfield.
Hello. Yeah, I found it really interesting, that interview, and actually a lot of the topics you were touching on seemed to, I didn't find your left field question that left field, because you were kind of linking things like, well, how has history impacted the way you're doing Cornish music now without it necessarily sounding like the music that might be played in communities in Cornwall. And one of the ways that I guess a lot of musical cultures end up diversifying is to be more commodifiable. And essentially that's what Gwenno's done. She's created something that a lot of youth people, whether in Cornwall or not in Cornwall, can engage with, because it sounds like a lot similar to the music that's on the radio today. So yeah, the whole branding thing, I think some people would say that, you know, safeguarding music shouldn't be to do with capitalism. It should be to do with people on the ground. But also you do need to get more people involved to be able to have people on the ground. So it is a circular thing. I'm not really asking a question, I'm just sharing my thoughts, but
more of a comment than a question. That's exactly, thank you. I suppose I would say left field in the sense that in the broader interview, it hadn't really touched much on kind of branding and promotion. But it, like you say, it does have that link of how, you know, how are you going to broaden your reach, and the kind of question of, do I make this sound more like other things, or do I stick to my own guns and, you know, pursue my own creative path? But what I thought was really interesting was that she's had this career in Celtic music and performance that has, in the Irish context, has been wildly successful in bringing Irish culture to a global stage. And something that didn't make it into the edit was part of how I think she was saying, and I hope I haven't got this wrong, but kind of trying to, at least in some of her earlier experiments, trying to sort of bring a bit of that kind of blitz and slickness into her work, not necessarily just to do the same, but in the Cornish language or in a Welsh context, but that, you know, where you draw your influences from as an artist, and what you're trying to do with it. I agree with you. It's that circular thing, and all kind of quite paradoxical of more individual, but also more more broad. I feel like now I've more commented than a question. Does anyone want to jump in? Okay. Anything you wanted to mention, Dan?
I mean, I could go on about this for ages, so it's probably best to...
Well, given that we've got 2 more interviews to get to, and there'll be chance for more discussion, should we take that moment of do you become really niche and sort of risk really narrowing down your audience, or will that nicheness kind of broaden out into something really global and massive, and move on to Merv's interview with Seamas, which talks about Aphex Twin. So I don't know how familiar or not everyone in the room might be with the output of Aphex Twin, but we're all about to go on a journey together. So bear with me a sec, and I will share the screen and share this interview between Merv and Seamas. Hold on. If you can't hear or see anything, drop me a message and we'll see what we can do. Hold on.
Welcome to Seamas Carey. That was Aphex Twin, an absolutely amazing track. Bit of video there. Now, I've got to confess that I was probably at the Bowdy Inn in the formative years of Aphex's Twin's career, listening to this DJ in the next room, turning my nose up because it was perhaps a bit commercial and populist. And from your article, I can see that I was absolutely and totally wrong. Now, that recording we just listened to, I listened to that without knowing any of the background, without knowing what it was called. and it hit me straight on. This is Cornish. This is about corn. This is about granite. This is about landscapes and so on. And I think actually, Seamas, that's really where you're coming from in terms of why Aphex Twin is Cornish.
Absolutely, absolutely. Out of interest, did you watch the video when you heard the track? Did you see the imagery at the time?
I saw the imagery, and the two together completely hit me, and there was no doubt in my mind this was Cornish.
Yeah, I think I did the same thing when a friend showed me that video, and I think that's an interesting point to make about Aphex Twin, that the imagery is really synonymous with the music and the sound, and he clearly puts a lot of time and budget into his imagery and his videos, and yeah, I mean, maybe I was affected by the imagery. You know, I wonder if I would have had the same feeling if I hadn't seen the video. But for me, that sort of pulsating, it's almost like a pulsating Gwenno pit, the different levels going. Whoa,
Yeah,
whoa.
yeah, absolutely amazing, and it really gets you right here. And I thought, well, you know, I can't analyze that. I can experience it, but I can't analyze it. And those images flashing at you along with the music.
Yeah.
And it kind of guides you into the music, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and you're right. It is quite overwhelming. His music, as I said in the article, can be sort of glitchy. And a friend of mine sometimes, which I think is quite accurate, it's quite dissonant and glitchy and yeah, sort of in your face. Some of it isn't particularly nice to listen to. Let's face it.
Well, there's a sense in which,
and it's kind of
I like about it. Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah,
and
that's what hit me. It's like it's the real Cornwall, not the Cornwall that's presented on GWR posters or it's how I experience Cornwall.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's where I was coming from, I guess, with my article about why I associate the sound of Aphex Twin with Cornwall, because I read a great book by David Byrne called How Music Works, and in the beginning of in the introduction, he makes an argument about how music is often shaped by its context. So choral singing, for example, is often quite slow, and it takes its time because choral music was often performed in churches where there's lots of reverb. If you were to play very fast melodies, it would all get a bit muddy. And then, for example, jazz music was very much from its context of in a basement and using the instruments that those, you know, African American musicians could find, and then he goes right through the sort of human experience right up to now, and then he makes the argument that a lot of music being made now, the context is to be listened to in your car and especially, but sort of, you know, music that boy races listen to with those massive sub-bass.
Yes.
Exactly, yeah. And the music is designed to fit that space, to fit that person's car, where it goes wop 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 wop. And I think context is interesting, isn't it? And for me, Aphex Twin was the sound of slightly badly organized parties and raves in fields, and that's how I associate. That's the landscape that I associate that music with, and then, you know, driving home late at night with that music still ringing in your ears because it was often so loud and abrasive. And so I think, yeah, for me, it's funny, isn't it? Context and landscape. And I just completely link the two together with Aphex Twin. And at the same time, it's an amazingly progressive sound, and it's, you know, been recognised and all over the world, and he has a following all over the world, and he's won, you know, Grammy Awards and has been nominated for the Mercury Prize. So he's accepted on a very mainstream level. But yeah, I think his music's coming, it feels to me like it's coming from a very kind of niche, subgenre of Cornishness.
Yes, I mean, I'm fascinated by his sudden contrast, because, you know, I was almost disappointed with one of the tracks you put up us. It was a piano piece.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't know how he played it, how he composed it, because I gather he wasn't a formal musician. He hadn't gone through the kind of trad route, or he hadn't gone through the formal music route. He must have been using a synthesizer keyboard or even a computer keyboard to create that sound.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I thought exactly the same thing. And that recording, it's Avril 14th that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's been, and that track probably is his most well played track, weirdly, even though it is quite different from the rest of his output.
Well, let's listen to that a sec. We'll play it on the video.
Let's.
Okay.
What's interesting about this track is it's because of its slightly sort of cinematic quality. It's his most well played track. If you look at Spotify, you get the most played track gets to the top, and that's always at the top.
That's the one that's there. Yeah.
It's been used in loads and loads of films and TV shows and adverts, and it pops up all the time, which is interesting in itself. So apparently, because I was talking to a friend about this, and it has a slightly ghostly quality, the way it's actually played on the piano. And it's actually, from my understanding, because on that album there's a lot of prepared piano tracks where he's sort of hitting bits of the piano and he's making unusual sounds. But this track was played with a MIDI keyboard. So he's played it. It's a MIDI file that is then almost like a piano, a player piano. So no one's actually playing the piano. The piano is being programmed by the computer. So funnily enough, as a child, I found piano players very ghostly, the ones that just play themselves and the keys go down, no one playing. So that's why it's got a slightly mechanic and the dynamics are slightly jolty sometimes, which is interesting. I mean, for me, this track says sort of beautiful, calm, safe Cornwall for me. And then someone said, "Oh, have you heard the backwards version?" And so I think Aphex Twin had taken the data of on the computer, the program data, and he just reversed it. So it's not a backwards recording. He's just taken the dots and played them in backwards, and then the piano's played it. And that's even more haunting because it sounds very familiar, like the tune but it's a little bit jolty and a bit it sort of doesn't quite lead, because the chord progressions don't go the way you'd expect them to go. They are backwards. So you go, "Oh, that's almost the same, but not quite." So I find, and interestingly, the image that he put with that is a picture of himself sleeping in a field of bluebells. And that summed it up for me.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, because that's what's different about his medium is that it's not played backwards. It's played in the normal way, but the tune's played backwards.
Yeah.
Yes, I was intrigued because he does say, "Oh, play this at 33 RPM rather than 45," which of course you couldn't do for a while with CDs. But now, of course, if you listen to his music on YouTube, that's exactly what you can do. I'm not sure you get exactly 33 RPM or whatever, but when he says this track slowly, I had to speed that to get it onto the LP. You can do that on YouTube, and it is really quite weird because you don't get a slowed down version. You get a different version.
Yeah.
It's not just a track slowed down. It's a different entity almost.
Yeah. There's a lot going on there. I mean, that's the thing. You cannot deny whether you like the sound of Aphex Twin or not, and whether you find it abrasive or relaxing, depending on your mood. There's so much going on, and it's very innovative, and there's a lot more thought behind it than you might think behind those glitchy sounds. And the other thing to say is, in terms of the field of electronica, he's very unique in his sounds and the sounds that he produces out of the software. I mean, I'd love to know what software and what instruments he does actually use. And friends of mine, we've sat around sort of speculating for hours late at night, thinking, I wonder if he uses one of those. But that's the thing about, I mean, I've dipped my toe into the world of synthesizers very briefly for writing soundtracks for shows. And you can just spend hours, if not days, disappearing into the rabbit holes of different sounds that you can make with electronic instruments. And fair dues on Aphex Twin. He goes there and he comes back with very unique sounds.
But he was doing this in the 1990s, a long time before we had access to that kind of technology.
Yeah,
I mean, he must have been doing it on machines that he was actually slowing himself. He must have been doing it in a very hands-on way.
Yeah, and absolutely. And this comes back to Cornwall, and it comes back to why is it so? Why would I associate it with this place? And particularly then, his first release, Analog Bubble Bath, was 1991. So he was making music from the late 80s into the 90s. He's making music in his bedroom with the stuff that he's got. And I think the word for me is a certain type of resourcefulness. And if you have to remember, obviously that was pre-internet. So in terms of being influenced by a scene, scenes were way more kind of located to a place at that point. And nowadays you or I could say, well, I want to make music which sounds like Berlin house music or Japanese minimalist music, and we could quite easily access that genre and that scene because it's there and it's online. Whereas in those days it wasn't. So the closest Aphex Twin could go was Bristol, or if he was lucky, London. And there was an electronica scene in Bristol, but the fact that he was in a rural place, in a peninsular place, quite far from any cities, making this unique sound. I think that taps into Cornish culture and history generally.
There's this wonderful video you provided with him being interviewed by John Peel. Then it went up Pitt at the same time as Paul Hodge, who's our current Grand Bard. And the juxtaposition is wonderful because, as you say, at that point in time, he couldn't get on the internet. So when he created his scene, he created it there.
Yeah.
Wherever he was at that.
There's something we need to talk about, which is, you could link it to Cornwall again, which is a certain mythology and sort of sneakiness. And there's so many rumours about Aphex Twin, and having grown up in Falmouth, which apparently he lives nearby, the amount of stories and gossip, if you like, of people going, oh well, I saw him in Costcotter last week in his jogging gear, and then someone said, oh well, I've heard he's got a tank, he's got an armoured tank which he drives around. And then there are stories about him. He lived in a bank vault in Elephant and Castle for a while. And whether these stories are true or not, he's a kind of master of PR and publicity in terms of you know, I was looking this morning, there's a whole load of different explanations about where the name Aphex Twin comes from, and apparently he had a stillborn brother who he then took, his mother wanted his name, and all these things which whether they're true or not, it doesn't matter. There's something about, you know, and of course there's lots of mythology linked to Cornwall, and I think that I find that very exciting. The fact
there is, because there is you know, the mythology and the lore often gets dismissed by the scientists, but in fact, the expression is it's information rich. It's, you know, the stories around stone circles don't tell you how they were made. They tell you how they were received over generation and generation. There's a sense here in which these stories about Aphex Twin don't tell you about his physical origins. They tell you about how he perceived himself and how others perceived him, which actually is probably more important than, you know, his actual story of where he lived, and that is how he saw himself.
Totally. And then here we are continuing the mythology, because here we are speculating on stuff. Well, totally. And that's what makes that video, the Gwenno Pit video with John Peel, and Luke Vibert, his friend, I should mention, you know, that's what makes it so special, because if YouTube was inundated with of interviews of Aphex Twin, we'd all get bored and we'd hear the same stories over and over again. But he is quite a recluse, and he gives so few interviews that I mean, you know, as somebody, I can't remember, there was a great documentary about him on Radio 4. And somebody said, well, he was the master of, you know, if you stand in front of a red curtain at the beginning of your film or your show, you leave the mystery that there's something behind that red curtain at all times. And which is what Morecambe and Wise did. They'd stand in front of this big red curtain with something to reveal. And that always leaves you wanting more. And I don't think Aphex Twin lifts the curtain. If anything, he just confuses you more. And
we're not even sure what he looks like, because he keeps changing what he, you know, some of it looked like, you know, somebody behind a DJ mixing something. And sometimes you get this face coming up and you think, you know, where is the real Aphex Twin?
Yeah. Well, funny you should say that. There's a brilliant story on the Radio 4 documentary about it, and a guy has an anecdote about he saw Aphex Twin DJing in Manchester, I think, in a sort of warehouse venue in the late 90s or early 2000s. And the music, everyone was dancing, but the music was getting so sort of obscure and inaccessible that people sort of started dropping off and just sitting down because the music was becoming so challenging to dance to. And the man who told the story said he found himself laughing. He was still dancing, but he was laughing his head off because it was just so ridiculous. This music was so horrible. And then
it took over, it took control. Yes, I can imagine.
Yeah. And then he turned to somebody else, and there was another man dancing, and they started laughing. They sort of made eye contact, and they started laughing. And then another man walked past, who was also laughing, and it was Aphex Twin. And they went, hang on a minute. And they looked up, and there he was up on the podium DJing. And this man was still left to this day confused whether either Aphex Twin had a double that would walk around the audience to confuse people, or whether he'd get a double to go up on stage and mime. And meanwhile, he'd walk around the audience to confuse people and just sort of, you know, and I think the idea that he could just take liberties like that is I'd love it. I'd love it. You'll also see that some of his track titles are just like he's gone like this on the laptop and just put anything in. So it's just a load of random letters and numbers, and it gives you this impression of sort of like he couldn't care less about what that track's called. He's made it. He's just gonna sort of bosh it out and put it on an album, and it doesn't matter what it's called. But then you're right. Then he gives names to tracks which are very specific place names, which again adds to the intrigue of, you know, what's that? Did he go get inspired by that place? Is that a favorite place of his? Again, I love the mystery of it, and now I go to those places and think, oh, this is where that Aphex Twin track is named after. What the meaning behind that is still again open for interpretation.
Well, I have to say that, one of my drives after going through all this is to download some of those tracks, get some of those tracks, go to Kernewek, go to Doom Dumpers, put these headphones on, bring it right up to full volume, and
Yeah.
just see whether I can experience whatever it was he experienced when he was there.
That's a great idea. Somebody actually did, somebody's a friend of mine, but I can't tell you his name because the book was written anonymously, but it is available in shops in Cornwall. They did a walking trip where they went on a map and they linked all the places that were named in Aphex Twin track titles.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And he went on the walk and he just basically wrote his diary of that experience. And exactly that. And it's quite sweet. He sort of just, mulls over ideas that maybe could have been had by Aphex Twin or maybe not. You'll never know. Out of interest, are some of his track titles in the Cornish language?
Yes, there's one which I cannot explain at all, and it's called Kesson Dalek. So it's obviously a Doctor Who's dialect, and Kesson is harmony. So dialect harmony. What does that mean? I was rather hoping you'd have an answer, but I think you.
I don't know.
No.
My only interpretation would be that it sounds like the sounds of a Dalek. The noises.
Yeah.
In harmony, but he's used to Cornish words.
It is quite significant because he would have had to. That wasn't just a place name. He would have had to have connected, recognised, and acknowledged something to do with the Cornish language to get that particular. Because it's not. It's not an obvious thing. You'd have to look it up.
Yeah.
I'm not just going to be there staring at you. You'd have to have some knowledge of Cornish to do that, or at least be interested. And I think that to me again adds to this beautiful mystery we have, and perhaps that's where we should be leaving Aphex Twin is as a mystery, as a legend, as a bit of lore for us to carry on enjoying.
Yeah, I would argue that he is modern mythology and lore, and adding to that rich scene of mystery that can be has been found in Cornwall, and hopefully will continue to be.
Well, shall we leave it at that, and we'll listen to the track itself, Kesson Dalek, shall we?
Great. Yes, please.
Thanks ever so much for a really fascinating conversation with Seamas about Aphex Twin there, Merv. I'm sure you've got plenty you want to say about it, but from my just from my listen through to the interview, Richard D. James, the man behind Aphex Twin, is absolutely regarded as a world leader in intelligent dance music, and he's been going for a long time, and he has a global fan base that take a lot of joy in kind of trying to decode and understand some of the more enigmatic elements of what he does. And his music is that varied. You know, you've got these amazingly, what I think are quite haunting, melancholic piano melodies, and then the track that we heard at the beginning, and plenty others as well, are really complex electronic compositions that are so information rich and layered that for a lot of people it's not actually that much fun to listen to. And I've seen him a couple of times, but from Seamas's story I'm kind of now questioning whether I have seen him a couple of times. And he is kind of something I find quite interesting, and it seems like Seamas does as well, is that a kind of paradox of managing to be quite enigmatic, but in his earlier releases at least he was doing not the done thing at the time for sort of electronic artists, which was having his face all over his record. So if you look up his album covers and his videos, you'll see a lot of what we assume is Richard D. James's face, and now he has sort of disappeared into a mystery and shrouded by all sorts of sightings and rumours. And how much of it is his own doing and how much of it is the kind of like development of momentum and admiration that's grown up around him, it's probably a bit of both. But and I'm quite interested in Seamas's interpretation that the contrasting output reflects a contrasting Cornwall, which I think came across really well. I mean, what do you think, Merv?
Yes, I mean, I think that I had this vision of Aphex Twin watching that interview and thinking, what a load of rubbish, because everything about him is made up. We don't know him at all. We place interpretations on what he's doing, but those interpretations tells you about me. It tells you about Seamas Carey. It doesn't tell you much about Aphex Twin, and I think that therein lies a kind of, it really is a modern myth. It tells you about the people who perpetuate the myth, nothing at all about the person themselves. I've no idea what he thinks about himself. We will never know. In a way, I'm slightly regretful, because I had a period of time in the 1780s when I had no television, completely dismissed what I described as Anglo-American mega crap on the popular music scene. And of course, in doing so, you miss this kind of stuff as well. And I look back now and I think, well, a missed opportunity. I would have been a great fan of I'm a great fan of Aphex Twin, but only now, thanks to Seamas Carey. I would and did completely dismiss it out of hand at the time. But you stop and listen and think, actually, there is a real Cornwall there. And that to me is the point, that he wasn't depicting the Grand Kerner that we might have feared, that we talked about before. He was depicting what he perceived industrial Cornwall, as it were.
Absolutely. We were talking a little bit before about how this kind of like electronic music often in a popular sense perhaps makes us think of an urban environment and like dance music and nightclubs and a kind of urban scene. But I think the distinction between urban and industrial is really interesting, because it sounds like hard work, quite a lot of Aphex's music. I did set myself a challenge once because I had a load of it on my iTunes, and I just wanted to make sure I'd listened to all of it as a late teenager in my early 20s. So I sat down and listened to it, and bits of it are really hard work, and maybe that does immediately reflect the kind of industrial element that you and Seamas have picked up on. Julie's in the chat has mentioned, as you've been talking, it's reminded me of another scene that I'd forgotten that Aphex Twin mined, which was the influence of avant-garde composers like John Cage, who pushed the boundaries of what music can be defined as and the edges of sound, noise and music, something we connect to bodily rather than with our intellect. Really nice interview. Thank you, Julie. Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd read somewhere that the Aphex Twin had once had a piece of work played to a really famous, I'm going to kick myself now, I should have prepared for this before, but a really famous avant-garde composer who gave him some feedback, and his response to the feedback was essentially like, I don't care what you think, I'm making stuff for people to dance to, which it kind of goes with someone like the sort of the stubbornness, I suppose, that we've you can kind of see in other bits of his output and his well, some of his approach to his marketing and what he does with his music or was doing. What else have we got in the chat? Glad that someone else, Judith, you'll be looking him up. Brilliant. Sarah, really worth watching the John Peel video with Aphex Twin and Paul Hodge. Both their interpretations of Cornish landscape are really interesting fun. And Merv's pointing out that the video is with Seamas's article on the CNMA website. So that's all really good. Dan.
Interesting about how you've picked up about maybe the difficult to listen to is representing the industrial side of Cornwall, because I maybe would have thought something different. And when I've always talked to people outside of Cornwall about Aphex Twin, particularly when it's been on at raves in warehouses in London that I've been to, the conversation kind of tends to flow towards the expressions of the difficulty of the depravity of Cornwall and the anti-establishment sentiment that can be gained from not feeling represented on a wider scale. And that's not my thoughts, but that's what other people have assumed. And then looking into kind of the way that Aphex Twin produces music and even some of his titles as well, whether it's Cornish Acid or this, that, and the other, the way that he's clearly representing a culture that is anti-establishment. And I think that's an interesting kind of line of inquiry to think of it in as well.
I would love to be able to have a conversation with Richard Dweetreens and ask him how far or not he feels like he's representing Cornwall, because he might, who can say, as an artist, he might just be like, this is just stuff I'm working with and the music is my own imagination and I don't have a broader political agenda or a social point to make. But it's exactly these interpretations that are really interesting.
Well, we make the political points, we make the interpretation, and so our interpretation of what he's doing tells you about us. I mean, certainly, you know, there's a feeling in Cornwall being anti-establishment, so we seize upon that when he expresses it.
Yes and no, but I think there's something to be said for being a product of where you're raised as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so Cornwall will have influenced him to a point where that's why I think it's appropriate to call his music Cornish.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things I was going to kind of throw into the room and say, you know, for a lot of people, this wouldn't sound remotely Cornish in the sense of it might not sound like what we think of as traditional music or associated with like a brass band or a choir or a kind of choral group or whatever it happens to be. Like we're stretching, broadening our, well, maybe we're not stretching and broadening, but kind of looking for Cornishness in all sorts of different musics, which I think is really important.
But when he connects, when he connects the music to the images of Redruth, suddenly it feels very Cornish. All that granite, those mining images, the whole structure just feels so Cornish.
Yeah. I was going to ask the room, like, is there any other sort of unusual or not on a first glance inspired by Cornwall music that you feel represents, but we might come on to that in a minute with Chris's interview, unless we've got any other points we want to make or talk about just now. You sure, Dan?
Again, this is a rabbit hole I've thought a lot about, so
well, we'll have a longer chance for discussion at the end. I'm just looking at the time and going 11:30, and we have one more interview which we really excited to press play on in just a sec. So this is Aphex Twin pushing the boundaries of what some might consider to be Cornish music or reflective of Cornwall in some way, and making that distinction is a challenge that our next interviewee, Chris Trevena, who is here with us, has encountered time and again in his work. So if you give me just a tick, I will hopefully get this final interview ready to play. And again, huge thank you to Chris for helping me by bringing this into a half-an-hour format. 1 second. Sound on. Any problems with the sound or the picture, please drop me a message.
Next, I'm really pleased to be speaking to Chris Trevena, who has been working on a fantastic project for the past 2.5 years called Sounds Like Cornwall. Welcome, Chris, and thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a huge pleasure. And Chris has put together a short video introduction to the project, which we're now going to watch and listen to.
Hello, and welcome to this presentation on Sounds Like Cornwall. It started on May 20th, 2020, as I was walking around the streets of Redroof looking for some new records, as I've just picked up a new turntable. As you can imagine, a lot of Jim Reeves, which really didn't tickle my fancy. However, within Oxfam's record crate, I saw something big, yellow, and recorded at the Royal Albert Hall. Little did I know that it was 1,000 Cornish male voices with the Camborne Town Band accompanying them. Prior to this discovery and later reading Tony Mansell's book on the band, I had really not known too much about Camborne Town Band. Generally through secondary school we learned a little bit about Richard Trevena, however we did not know so much about what was in our very own town, or even the musical legacy of Camborne. So this very much was the start of this journey. Earlier this year, I managed to have a delightful conversation with Richard Trevena, who told me the story of a chap called Richard Jose. Jose was born in Lanner, which was a prominent mining circuit, but soon his father had passed away. He had to go over to New York to meet his uncle. Upon arrival, however, the uncle was not there. Jose, 14 at the time, then had to walk from New York to Nevada to where his uncle was meant to be, and sang along the way. In the case of Right Place at Right Time, Richard Jose soon became the world's first countertenor to ever be recorded on wax cylinder. In 1915, Richard Jose appeared in the first ever talkie movie, which consisted of a silent film with Richard Jose singing live over the top. After a success in the States, Richard Jose hopped back on the boat to Plymouth, took a train down to Redroof. Despite his success in the States, Richard Jose was met with zero fanfare. Richard then had to walk from Redroof to Lanner, where he used to live. Although no chariot awaited Richard at Redroof, many houses held a candle within their window, illuminating his journey. After settling back in, Richard sung at the local chapel in Lanner, before going back to America and continuing his singing career. Now those are just two stories that really piqued my interest into looking into Cornish music, which leads us to, well, what is all this? What is Sounds Like Cornwall? So Sounds Like Cornwall is first a digital archive, collecting and digitizing shellac, vinyl and cassettes from the 20th century all the way through to where we are today. Secondly is about mapping where Cornish music has come from, and to do so I've created a digital map online to which viewers can zoom around, go into any town or parish in Cornwall and discover just how much music has come from one specific area. Thirdly is to give back to the Cornish music community, and to do that I've voluntarily been recording concerts throughout the year 2022 and into the future as well. The fourth extension of this project is not to just record concerts via audio, but also filming as well. Just this year, we've now amassed 163 videos uploaded to YouTube. So in addition to all this, viewers can also go on to the spreadsheets that has been made, so they can sort through alphabetically, numerically by release year as well as genre. And that about wraps up this presentation. Just want to say thanks so much for your time in listening to what this is all about.
So as you mentioned in your intro, Sounds Like Cornwall emerged just around the time of the COVID-19 pandemic when you discovered the recording of Camborne Town Band performing at the Royal Albert Hall in, was it the Red Roof Oxfam?
It was, yeah.
So could you tell us just a little bit more about that moment of coming across that record and what, why you had to find out more about it and what sort of how it spurred this project?
Yeah, sure. So I was just sort of kicking stones around Red Roof because I don't like to be early to a meeting, especially a work meeting. So charity shops are really, even now, still very like akin to my heart, just finding little knickknacks that they'll speak to you. But in the context of that time, getting a new record player is a sort of a buzz and as to what can sound good on it. So I was going through the crate and I think I got it here, pre-planning. This is it. This is the very edition. It's just marvelous, really. Something big, something yellow, something loud and proud, black and gold with a lovely picture of the Royal Albert Hall and Camborne Town Band. So in searching for things that spoke to me, I think this hit the nail on the head very well, because this was really the first ever record for me to learn that there was such a strong history, as I later discovered, with music, song, dance, and even a cappella singing just in pubs called shouts. So for me, this was absolutely fantastic, and to also learn of how the definition of a celebrity isn't restricted by like world view, but more so the people in your actual community, these people here who have fabulous voices, fabulous will to continue their heritage and allow it to grow and invite everyone along for the ride. So it really just changed so much about how I viewed where I lived. At that time was Camborne, and I did not know too much about it at all. Tony Mansell's Camborne Town Bound book was also instrumental in just learning a bit about what's just down the road. Once you discover what is down the road, you want to learn what's on the other side of the street. And so you end up with an archive with nearly 700 artifacts 2.5 years later.
Yeah, I mean that's quite an incredible journey you've been on since that very first recording. I've got to ask, like, so prior to that moment, had you been interested in music sort of more broadly or more generally? Had you had much of an interest in music relating to Cornwall at all, or was that record at the very beginning?
In terms of, yeah, so local music certainly, but it wasn't the folk, the country, the choirs, and effectively what I listen to on a very regular basis now. It was more so the punk and hardcore fraction of Cornish music. So coming into being 17, MySpace was the word. You could find out everyone that's playing music in your vicinity on MySpace. It was a really useful tool. And there's a band called Crocus, and they were really the first local band to ignite the flame of wow, this is stuff that's happening on our doorstep. We should cherish this because nothing lasts forever. So they very kindly snuck me into the Clipper Bar in Camborne. I was just shy a few months underage, but nevertheless I did get in there, and the beating heart of the musicians that played was so ferocious. It was incidentally theatrical. That felt like a choreography, but it also felt spontaneous as to what could happen next, and that was really exciting for me, because up until that time the only gig I'd gone to was when I was a really youngster at the Butlins Redcoats. So to see this act out in the town that I lived at the time was very exciting. That progressed into Truro Live Bar, where every Friday, Saturday, and sometimes a Thursday would be a really great mix of musicians coming from all over the world. You know, not just up the road, but America, Canada, Europe, New Zealand, Australia, etc., come into one little melting pot in Trevena Live Bar. And then later on, towards the end of the scene, because of, you know, it's a blip, you're there and then it's gone, was Dirty Sundays with Jack Stringer. And she was this sort of elusive figure whose name gets spoken throughout the venue, called the godmother of Cornish punk. And she puts on Dirty Sundays, and I was like, oh, I really want to go on there. And the great thing about it was on a Sunday. It started in the afternoon, which meant that under 18s could go, but also public transport connections were available to you. So it was a really, you know, evolving community where then if you had any crafts or records to sell, then you could sell it at Dirty Sunday. And you know, long history with Cornish punk music. Then there was a lull, and then effectively this project happened, and now I'm going to a concert every week that's celebrating songs that have been sung in the Duchy for over hundreds of years.
Gosh, yeah, that's marvelous. And to think that you kind of like have come from a background of like engaging musically and being interested in accessible music as well. That's really important. I wanted to ask you what's drawn you to the project of collecting recordings in particular. Like, obviously you're making your own recordings, and we'll come back to that a bit later, I hope, but you've collected a wide range of recordings. Why do you think the recordings are important to bring together in the archive project that Sounds Like Cornwall?
Yeah, so it's two main reasons. One, there is that personal enjoyment of this stuff. I try not to be choosy and just appreciate that it exists more so than any sort of subjective feelings towards it. But secondly, it's just important to have, because what I found is that a lot of this stuff ends up in charity shops, which can be very, very choosy on what they put out on the shop floor. And so if Cornish music doesn't sell and return revenue to the charity, then where is it best be? It's best to be in the landfill. And I think once I got to about 20 records, I was just like, well, gosh, how much is out there? I don't think there is a number, but it's hopefully to be seen more than a just a collector, but more so a sharer. So should anyone want to borrow the record, you know, I'm very willing for it to be like a library, and that they can hold it, because it might be, if anything is off the YouTube comments to go by, a lot of people are commenting, especially on the choirs, like, oh, this is the first time I've heard my grandfather's voice. You know, it's been decades. He sung on this Nan Kersey record in the 1980s, and you know, if nothing else, if it brings people back to the people that were creating the stuff, then that's very important to me. So not just collecting, but hopefully connecting people to it.
Yeah, that's marvelous. The community side of it, as we've talked about, is so important, whether you're an audience or a performer or a bit of both, or like yourself, kind of getting involved on the recording side. And it's been really interesting, the sheer variety of styles and genres of recording that you've brought together, and in managing to uncover such a wealth of that material. Just coming back to your point about being choosy, like, how do you decide what is or isn't relevant or might go into Sounds Like Cornwall? Because it's a question that we come up against at the CNMA as well, when you cast the net incredibly wide in order to like capture as much as possible, but you've always finding that point of relevance. Have you got a process, or is it a kind of a gut feeling?
I say more so a gut feeling of what will be enjoyable first and foremost, because ultimately what I do is going out there and recording and effectively building upon an archive that everyone else has historically contributed to. I'm just one of many people who are trying to put it together and work with people in that way. So yeah, so there's got to be enjoyment first, but secondly, importance. So you know, something may be going on that I'm not particularly interested, but what I see in terms of its effect on the local people, or the sort of conversation that it's brought in relation to Cornwall, its music, its language, those are voices I think are worth recording and documenting, simply due to the fact that it's brought attention to this lovely land, this lovely heritage, and who am I to decide or censor that? I do really want to be within the middle and let the future, because ideally what this is all for is not necessarily now, but in 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, maybe 100 years, if we get that far, that people can certainly unlock this cachet of material and just think, wow, this is a huge quantity of what was going on in a very small period of time. So it's, like a time capsule, if you will.
No, that's incredibly valuable. And as we were saying, like that wealth and variety of different things that you've come across and you've captured, can you give us a sense of the breadth of recordings that you've put together in the project?
Yeah, so with the audio stuff is really going into interview territory now, because concerts might be getting a bit too cold in these lovely large chapels. So really want to connect with the voices and stories of people. So recently, the first interview I did was with John McGovern, who's a volunteer at a place I work at, Levant Mine near Pendeen, and he's an ex-miner. He worked down at South Crofty, and so being the workplace, being the culture of mining, he was ideal to sort of break the ice, and he was very delightful and very animated and a fantastic storyteller. I don't know if people understand this, how good they are at telling a yarn, if you will. So he was fantastic. Then he recorded a chapter from Brenda Wotton's For the Love of Cornwall with Sue Every-Hill. So that's currently in the edit. And again, her animation just really brings the words off the page, and you just feel like you're there. Most recently, just interviewed Jack Stringer, who I mentioned with the Dirty Sundays, because part of me was feeling like, oh wow, I do, kind of quite familiar with Jack. Didn't know how she'd feel about it, but she was so up for it, and I learned so much from her that I didn't already know about her contributions to local music, which was just really fantastic. So interviews, also shouts, really trying to understand shouts. So we got the Hillary Coleman, Sally Burley duo going around recording music, and they've been so again really generous in allowing me to ask questions, and having the patience, and inviting me to come to their sessions at the Countryman Inn on a Sunday, and also Mel Babb who does sessions at the Countryman Inn. So recently they've done the Black History Month Shout and Holler, and it was great to hear these collection of songs, unfortunate context, but still being sung today in the pubs, where you go into a pub, you hear a song, you move on with work, you take that song to another pub, and you move on, and that's how music travels. That's folk music, and that's a really beautiful thing.
No, that's amazing. You've really brought things into your recordings, and genres and styles that I wouldn't have known about from my own musical experience in Cornwall, and that's valuable to bring that breadth and different perspective to the project. I wondered if you had any sense of like what might be the most unusual thing you've uncovered, or possibly a favourite recording that you would point people to in your 700 plus recordings.
How avant-garde you want to go?
I think you should pick whatever it is.
I think I might have one just in the front of this case here. It's an electronic album. I mean, even the cover is very strange and elusive. So I don't know if anyone here would be able to recognize this illustration.
I don't.
To be honest, I wouldn't even remember what they were called. Skeleton birds and the number of God, these dark roots of heaven. This is very, very, very strange, but if you give it a time, it's worth it. So the information that is provided that it was recorded in Cornwall in 2009, and for me, that's all it takes to be interested of trying to see in terms of the genre length and breadth of Cornwall, the sort of almost delicious, so palatable music that is just a joy to listen to something that's on the complete other extreme. And I think this one here fits that bill. It's very much like sound design, but yeah, Skeleton Birds and the Number of Gods. If anyone does want to check that out, that is online. It's very, very elusive. I don't believe it had too many prints, but it was one of those broadening of the horizons of what is to be discovered, perhaps again in the future.
That's amazing. So sorry, is that Skeleton Birds, The Number of God? The Number of God, is that the artist or is that the album title?
That's the artist, and sorry, These Dark Roots of Heaven is the album.
Amazing. And is, as far as you can tell, is the connection just the location of the recording?
Purely location.
Amazing.
But so it's like, what part of Cornwall inspired that? I do want to sort of go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, but we've in Cornwall, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. I'll kick myself in a minute. But the incredibly famous recording studio down near Foy, I think it is, isn't it? Where
Gallant Sawmills.
That's Sawmills. There you go.
Yeah.
That recording studio, which has been the birthplace of seminal albums that people would the world over know and treasure. But it sounds to me like this project has given you a kind of window into kind of Cornish history and culture that you hadn't had in the same way before. One of the things that you mentioned in your intro there was about Richard Jose. Can you tell us a bit more about how you might have kind of started to delve deeper into Cornish life and history through this project? Yeah,
so as per that part in the presentation, I don't know about you, but does that sort of gets the taste buds going? I just want to learn a bit more about that, and who else have incredible stories like that. So there's not much written about Richard Jose, but I mean that's enough, right? So yeah, and then Richard Trevena first told me that song on a sort of video call, as we're doing here, but then later mentioned that he wrote that song about him, which if no one's heard, it's Richard Trevena, Richard Jose, but in YouTube is a fantastic song that really just illustrates his life and career. And then another character that was really inspiring to me was Miss Rose Warren, or Mrs. Rose Warren of Cairnbourne. She was just a dialect speaker, just tells stories, but would sell out various venues simply by the jokes that she told. But correct me if I'm wrong, I do think she started before Jeffro, so she was sort of Cornwall's first comedian, if you will. and she was just in Campbell and on Trelawarren Street. So apparently, when she moved house, the whole town came out and celebrated when she put the key in the door. So that's such a beautiful thing. And Chris Blout of Chuff Tapes was, he was there at the right place at the right time for many things, but capturing this sort of local hero, local celebrity, it's really good. And that's the sort of stuff to be proud of. It's just being there with the enthusiasm, recording, and then later on, the value of you doing that out of your own bag grows up, because nostalgia, you can cash in on that. But not I'm saying financially, but in terms of like enriched social and spiritual fulfillment. And
oh yeah, I think the sheer number of recordings that you've managed to find or create yourself kind of are a testament to the value of music and to communities of all different sorts in Cornwall, across the years. And with that kind of across the years, obviously you said that your first find was a record, but you've found various different types of recordings as well. So you've got your LPs, but it would be really interesting to hear what other sort of formats you've found, because you've found some shellac and tapes and private presses, and it would be great to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, so at the start there was plenty of vinyl to find in the charity shop crates, and then what was noticeably difficult was cassettes. And now with vinyl having a revival, there's more of a sense and reason to put it out on the shop floor, but for a cassette player, not so much perhaps. So cassettes got really difficult to find, and the sort of ambition to find cassette was quite quickly overtaken records, LPs, and then shellac. That's a very modern way to harbor music in your own home, because of course before we had record players, if you wanted to hear a note of music, you needed to go somewhere. You had to go out of your comfort zone in the winter, go down the pub where there's a ceilidh or a traditional or even little brass band going on, tea treats. So you had to look for music, and with wax cylinders to shellac, that was very much an American thing, I believe. And so to have anything that's made in Cornwall on a shellac disc is just amazing. So this Divine Being here was recorded in 1983, with next year being 2023. I think we're due a rerun. Maybe not at the Royal Albert Hall. I think their fees have gone up since. But I think if we could do something, organise something where there's a huge mass choir around that time in Cornwall in November, early November, that would be very fulfilling.
That would be magical. We've got a year, and I'm sure there'll be people out there listening who will want to get involved and help.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. If you've got the contacts, let's have a chat.
Recording equipment. Yeah, marvellous.
All right, that brings mine and Chris's chat to a close. Chris, nice to see you. Thanks so much for being here and helping put that video together. You've done so much probably even since then. I can't quite remember when we recorded it, but I'm going to say it was either in November or December. And you've been on quite a journey, and it's been a massive program of work that you're doing on a voluntary basis. And it's so valuable because you've not only looked at the recordings that you've managed to find in all sorts of nooks and crannies, but starting to look at interviews, essentially doing oral histories. And it all seems to be kind of like part of that sort of DIY effort that so many Cornish projects I find tend to tap into, because you've just got to get on with it, haven't you? Anything that jumps out from what we were talking about then that you particularly want to come back to, or that you've done since that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, well, the DIY effort really comes from, I'd say, Jack Stringer and a lot of the Truro punk and metal scene that was around in the noughties. Of you got to do it yourself, and that's what I found really inspirational, and it's what really taken me through the past 10 years. So it's really just building on the work, or building on the inspiration of the work of others, and trying to continue working together.
No, I think you've done an amazing lot of work over the course of this project. Something that I think you did not long before Christmas, and is going to obviously be a particularly valuable and interesting interview, is the interview you did with John the Fish, who's recently passed away.
Mm-hmm.
For those of us who haven't seen that interview, can you tell us a little bit about John the Fish and his position and why he's important for music in Cornwall?
Sure, yeah. See, I really only knew him for his work with the late Brenda Wootton, and just really enjoyed Sailor Camp, his LP. So I didn't really know too much about his historical background before reading Sue Ellery Hill's book about Brenda Wootton. Sorry, car. So that was like a really wonderful introduction. So where I work at between Levant and Batalic, one day John the Fish just walked on in with wife Carrie, and it was just a wonderful opportunity to talk to someone who's been so influential with folk music in arguably the end of the earth in West Benwith. So that was really wonderful. I asked if he'd be up for it, and he said yes. So he wanted to do it in the very place to which the folk club came to prominence, and that's what we did. Unfortunately, it was very wet outdoors, because we wanted to have a walk around the site and talk about it, especially the image of him and Brenda at the Kelsoner. Got it just here. So it would have been wonderful just to have another photograph with John the Fish with this album. But in lieu of the rain, we've got a wonderful photograph with John holding Sailor Camp in the doorway of the Folk Club. So really fortunate to not only have met him personally and had the time that we had together, but also to capture an interview and a photograph as well. So yeah, really a highlight in this journey so far.
Amazing. Yeah, I've had never met him, and when I saw that you'd managed to interview him, I thought that's fantastic. Because yeah, these kind of interviews and oral histories, I mean, I know I've said it before at other symposiums, but knowing that someone is out there doing this kind of recording work means that someone in, like you say, in 50 or 100 years hence will have that material to look back on and to interpret and analyze and understand a bit more about what was happening at this time. And I've been on the receiving end of that, and having been that future scholar, and it's fantastic and incredibly valuable work. I was going to ask if you have a what next, like do you see a particular next direction for Sounds Like Cornwall? Are there certain types of event that are drawing your interest, or are you just sort of seeing what comes your way and which direction you'll end up taking naturally?
Yeah, well, on a community element, in just seeing and experiencing what is actually going on in Cornwall and just actually living it, because this is very new to me in a way that it wasn't a part of my sort of upbringing to attend all the various wonderful events that go across from east to west Cornwall. So really, as a personal endeavor, I really like to just experience that and just sort of celebrate the people who are doing it, because tradition only exists through participation, and that's just really what I want to champion. I quite like to do a few anniversary sort of celebrations of records. So this year the combined Stivians Ladies and Male Voice Choir did a record on Sankey tunes, Iridi Sankey, and so hopefully we can put something together to celebrate the music of Stivians with both choirs as well as the town band as well. So just really beat the Stivians drums and just really make it known of how much musical heritage can come out of a very small village, so that's really it. And just to continue what's currently ongoing, so talking to people past and present of myriads influences within Cornish music, and to really just learn more about what a wonderful thing we have down here.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really exciting that you've already putting in plans in place, because I've got it right, haven't I, of course, that you were involved in recording various bits of Lewenda Perrin and Redruth last year, and the kind of making sure that there's been a record of that transition as well, and all the kind of different bits and bobs that go into the festival. I say that like bits and bobs, it's a small thing, it's a huge effort. I mean, Merv, you might want to jump in at this point, I'm not sure, because Lewenda has had recording before, but I don't think, well, I might be wrong, but I'm not sure I've come across a project quite the same as Chris's.
No, it's
Oh,
certainly with Lewenda Perrin, we were fortunate in having Ted Chapman, who captured 25 odd years of Lewenda Perrin. But I think overall the sheer breadth of what we've got here, all those bands, I mean, what do you say, over 700 albums now you've captured. I had no idea there was that much music. I mean, you were aware of the breadth of it, but that's an awful lot. And also what you capture, which others don't, is those little albums that a band produced 40 of to sell at gigs. And that I think it is magic, absolutely magic.
On that note, I would like to just promote this very funny 7-inch single by I can't remember, Beverly Bunt. So this was recorded in 1959. One of the earliest vinyl pressings I found for Cornwall, and Beverly Bunt, and this recording was age 7, and she was plucked from the Clay Country of all places, so a very sort of quiet place at that time. And she was taken up to London to record Me and My Teddy Bear. It's very sickly sweet. If high-pitched frequencies are a bit difficult for you, this might be a challenge to listen. But the idea that the quality of Cornwall's music was picked up, especially in the Clay Country, from producers in London coming down to sort of see what the vocal talent was like, for me is just an amazing story in itself.
Yeah, the sheer breadth of things that you've been picking up is amazing. And when we were doing the Clay Country project, we came across that St Austell Grammar School recording, because essentially you've also been managing to kind of find various bits of private press or really limited run recordings of schools or groups that are sort of vanishingly rare now, that were produced for, say a class at, like the grammar school one. And it's gone out of my head, but the man who recorded that, was it John Hall? No, was it Hall?
It escaped from my mind too.
He was. You also mentioned Chris Bant and Chuff Tapes, like starting to bring together some of those catalogues and see the breadth of what's in there. I think you've started to develop a really interesting network of who was recording what, kind of when and where. I mean, obviously, it's interesting because what's recorded isn't necessarily also everything that was going on. There might have been plenty of things that never made it onto a tape or onto a record, but bringing together what there is as methodically and in such a wide-ranging way as you are, I think is really valuable, and will be really helpful, hopefully, for future people who are interested in Cornish music for whatever reason. Does anyone know?
I think also what I like about it is because it's going up on YouTube, it makes it very much a living tradition. You know, if you enjoy some of that music, you carry on listening to it. It's no longer historical, it's part of what we have now. And I think that's one of the things that one can do with things like YouTube, it is to keep music alive and keep it around, keep it enjoyed. And that's what you've done. You know, if I find an album that I like there, then I will listen to it a lot. Wonderful.
That's right. Yeah, it's just been absolutely fantastic. Andrew Wetter just pointed out in the group. So a lot of the records I do try and as much as possible reach out to the authors of the music and talk to them a bit about it. Just learn to sort of document my own curiosity, and if they're happy themselves with it being online, overwhelmingly it's been very much supported. So it's all just a fantastic way to learn so much more about who was making, who was recording, and also using that sort of curiosity to see what's going on now. Recently recorded a folk session at the Bembo for the Cornish National Music Archive, which was a fantastic way just to celebrate what's happening now. And so hopefully over the course of this year to record as many folk sessions, just to get a snapshot, not to say it's a definitive experience, but just a snapshot of what currently what's going on for future generations to come.
Absolutely. I just whichever one of you was mentioned in the chat, Dan Woodfield makes the very fair point that it's not just impacting future scholars, it's helping him now, and he's only just started on his PhD. Julie says, thanks everyone for a morning demonstrating the richness and breadth of Cornish music, along with new food for thought. It's taken me back to attending tea treats as a young child, brass bands, country dancing, hearing the Docks band every Christmas, our dads and uncles singing together just for the fun of it, raising the pint during Trelawney, and all this precious social music making the Cornish way for so long. What a springboard for the future, and what an important resource to value and safeguard in these crazy current times. Thanks, Julie, absolutely. And Andrew Wetter, you're doing far more than a simple record collector. You're new recordings, events, interviews, and most importantly of all, sharing it. And yes, Andrew's written his, because you and Andrew know each other, but love how you reach out to members and ex-members of groups. So have you got any interactions that spring to mind from the people that you've reached out to? Because I know you've been quite careful to contact these artists to check that they're happy for their material to be shared.
Yeah, so mainly what really sticks out is the Mousehole Male Voice Choir. Unfortunately, being in Penzance, it's not too far to a stone throw to go to one of their rehearsals on a Monday night. I do recommend it if anyone's in the area on Monday night in Poole Church. But they've been really instrumental in helping me or be effectively the testing ground to learning about recording sound, and being very happy in providing sort of opinion and critique on the stuff that I'm doing, just to really help me build so I can volunteer for musicians and other choirs and brass bands across Cornwall in hopefully many years to come, on the basis of that really foundation of learning. So they've been a very sort of fertile ground for me to learn not just songs in the Cornish repertoire, but actually the means of creating better quality for generations to come as well.
Awesome. Yes, I haven't been down to the Mousehole Male Voice Choir, but I did. Is it Pete Robinson that we've spoken about before? Yeah, he's a fascinating man, and it would be lovely if you could interview him at some point, I think.
Yeah, he's a very busy man, unfortunately. He's hard to pin down, but I do nudge him if I see him. So hopefully we'll get that interview. For those who don't know, Peter Robertson is one of the few people who have attended every single massed male voice choir event at the Royal Albert Hall, and he's got some amazing stories to tell.
Oh, Merv's dropped a message into the chat saying Andrew mentioned punk bands Kestadhel. I'm not familiar. Is that one punk band or two? I remember groups like Saffron and Cousin Jacks who were all using band names to express Cornishness. A research story there. Thank you. Two bands. Yeah, there would be a really interesting essay or paper or something or video to make about the different band names, wouldn't there? Different ways of saying straight off the bat, we've got a reference here and it's something that's part of us and it's part of our music.
There's another one that Jacob Porter, who's in those two bands, terrible at the pronunciation, but Kraus and Ray in West Penwith. That was another band that I absolutely love. So you know, they do use Kernewek in their band titles.
Oh, excellent. I was seeing as you're here, and unfortunately Gwenno and Seamas aren't. Was there anything in their interviews that particularly jumped out for you? Because
yeah,
heard from you yet?
So was that for me? Sorry.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So the topic of making music for space was really really wonderful. I want to maybe just talk about Robert Kurgevan's Serenade LP. On track 2 on the side A is Cornubia, and that's a piece created about the history of Cornwall around that time. But the really interesting thing about this record is precisely that, recorded and created for the space. So yeah, between 2013 2014, Robert visited St Paul in Lugben, Tywednick, Lelant, and St Willow, and many more churches to record their organs and incorporate that into this LP effectively. And it's a very lovely, very slow droning album, but to have these recordings of all these organs in these places, which as we know, organs are going into disrepair, perhaps because of the lack of use that we have in Cornwall. So if anything else, this is a huge memento for the future to come. Recently, I just picked up a record by Hockey Smith. This is a copy by a chap called John, who sadly unfortunately passed away recently, but hopefully we can do an exhibition to celebrate him and his life, because he went around and recorded over 300 concerts as well. It's a sort of for personal collection, but has been sort of bestowed. So hopefully we can create something off it. But the conversation about Aphex Twin particularly really just heightened my brain about Hockey Smith, because this is a very interesting take on electronic music and pop music as well. During this record, it was Annie and her sister, but since they've incorporated other members, it's been a huge musical journey for Annabelle Hockey Smith. So I do want to highlight Hockey Smith's work in Cornish music of the electronical variety as well.
Oh, fab. Is that also up on Sounds Like Cornwall?
No, because yeah, because they're on a label, so we can't go there. But it is available online and on SoundCloud, so on their own personal channels.
Great. All right, thanks for highlighting that. We'll give that a listen. Any questions for Chris from our listeners? Because if we've kind of brought this section to a close, I'll stop recording, and then if there's a kind of broader discussion to be had, oh, Dan's put his video on, then I'll pause now. Dan, do you want to include this in the recorded section for Chris, or shall I stop and we'll have a broader discussion?
It's a specific question for Chris. I think it's interesting. You know, like I say, in already in my research journey, your work has been really important. And whether that's actually just being able to find albums that I hadn't been able to find before, and actually listen to them, or just being able to, you know, use some archival recordings in my own creative practice, that's been really invaluable. I wonder, do you foresee your work moving? Because at the moment, what you're doing, you're putting everything online and it's being shared, and that's wonderful. But where do you see your position as being able to help educate future generations of Cornish musicians as well?
Yeah, I feel hesitant on ever becoming a sort of a spokesperson on the topic. Is more so a really enjoyable hobby in that sort of context where I can just in the present day really enjoy it and participate in the past by discovering these records, really enjoy them and share the huge variety of Cornish music. But I do feel a bit like sort of hesitant on and never becoming, like, I don't know if an authority is too strong a word. I'd certainly always be up for conversations and really wanting to put on just free exhibitions in village halls and just create spaces for it and space for dialogue, certainly. But in terms of maybe any particular like set in stone writing, maybe not my area.
Yeah, well, I guess that's then what it seems to be the case in a lot of kind of topics coming up at the moment, is that a collaborative approach to which recognizes people's individual skills. And like, I think not many people would be able to do what you've currently done, and that's why it's quite valuable that someone like yourself is doing it. You know, my thoughts is like, let's get the man a job and give him some money for doing it. But you know,
what would be great, and I feel like this is where Kate's heart is as well, and perhaps Merv's, is to actually have a space for Cornish music somewhere in Cornwall that people can just come to and have a chat, and talk about it. So have a physical space where, you know, we could have record bins, people be able to go through and pick it up and put it on a vinyl player or a cassette, etc. And to have a physical space, I think, is what Cornwall needs, and hopefully sooner than later.
Yeah, Chris, you are right. It is my dream, and I'm sure many that we would have a space where you could, you know, have a physical collection of all the things that, you know, someone like you's brought together, but a space to perform, a space to rehearse, a space to discuss, and it, you know, it could, in the dream world, it could be for all sorts of other uses as well. But as someone whose first love is music, that's my dream for it one day. Frank has put a message in the chat to ask, has Chris found his own musical taste change with being exposed to more Cornish music?
I'm certainly more open, I'd say. I still listen to sort of punk and black metal is kind of, when I'm not doing this, it's kind of just what's in my ears. And field recordings, I do just love the sound of spaces, be it here locally or afar. It's really sort of meditative. So yeah, in terms of changes, I would say so much, but certainly more open to the way music is composed, and finding a deeper interest in the context, as we've discussed throughout today, in which how you can be found. So like an Aphex recording, that idea of going to a place to which is entitled in one of Richard's pieces, to me just sounds wonderful. So to have that sort of physical journey would be great as well.
Nice, thanks so much. I'll pause unless anyone's got anything else they want to ask Chris directly. I'll stop our recording now and then we can keep chatting about anything that anyone wants to bring up. 1 second.